Good morning, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me or if you need a microphone. Do you need a microphone? Is that helpful? I'll go with the microphone. Thank you so much to the May 18 Foundation. It's nice to be here with all of you. We have about 3 hours this morning to get into some of the fundamental questions about why refugee issues matter. And what I've planned to do this morning, and it's not something I'm used to doing, is to give a written speech, which we'll suffer through for about half an hour, and then we'll have an opportunity for some group discussions and some report backs, and some really casual conversation around the issue of refugees, getting people prepared for these next 2 weeks here in Gwangju. There'll also be a break in the middle, so don't worry about that, and we'll have coffee and we'll have a chance to just relax and sit through too many long discussions here. But I'll begin, and also feel free to interrupt me at any point in time if you have any questions or have trouble understanding or hearing, or you want to make a point about your own experience. This is going to be very informal, even though it's a written speech, at least for the first part. So, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here with all of you this morning in Gwangju. I'd like to thank the May 18 Foundation for the opportunity to join you and to speak during the opening session of the 2019 May 18 Academy. As you're all well aware, this year's thematic is the politics and economy of refugees. And in the spirit of Gwangju and the May 18 movement, it's certainly an appropriate one. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Themba Lewis. It's a Swazi name. I was born in Swaziland to American parents, so I'm American, but I have a Swazi name. And I am the Secretary General of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. APRIN, our acronym, is a network of more than 400 organizations and individuals across 29 countries in Asia and the Pacific, all working towards a common goal of advocating for refugee rights. From our Secretariat office, which is in Bangkok, we centralize these efforts and strive to influence progressive policy for the protection of people across the region. We work to raise awareness, challenge rights abuses, support advocacy efforts, and map new directions for positive change in the refugee sphere. It's a very large task with a diverse membership and a massive geographic scope. APRIN has existed for the last 10 years, and I've just got off to its start with a small supporting grant from the May 18 Memorial Foundation. We wouldn't be where we are without May 18, it turns out, so thank you to the May 18 Foundation for that. I know some of you in the audience are already familiar with APRIN. Some of you are already members, but I welcome all of you to approach me at any point to learn more, or you can approach Evan, sitting there in the white shirt, who also works with me in Bangkok at the Secretariat and has a long history with APRIN and knows a lot of the refugee issues across the region very well. In terms of my experience and why I'm here, why I was chosen to open this session, I began working with refugees in 1996 in Rwanda, just a matter of months after the official end of the genocide there. I've worked across Africa in refugee camps and cities and detention centers. I've worked in the Middle East and stayed through the Arab Spring revolutions, working to ensure refugee populations in Egypt, abandoned by the closure of international assistance and protection organizations, were still able to access some basic services. I've worked in Eastern Europe, trying to build legal protection mechanisms as the EU increasingly pressured governments to restrict access to refugees crossing the European frontier along its eastern border with Turkey. I've worked in deportation centers in the UK, situated in warehouses at the ends of the airport runways at Heathrow and at Gatwick in London. I can't say that I know what it's like to be a refugee. No one does until you become one. But I've seen refugee dynamics from a number of vantages, in a number of contexts. And I've worked with refugees for most of my adult life. I've seen great success, and I've seen catastrophic failure. I've been asked to provide a lecture here, now, today, on the topic of why refugees and refugee issues matter. And I'll try to do that. They've clearly mattered to my life. But before I do that, I thought it would be a good step to get to know a little bit about all of your engagements with refugees and why you were chosen to be in this room today. So briefly, I thought we could go around, and maybe it's a question I'd like to ask a lot of people. What's your first experience with a refugee? Maybe you're a refugee yourself. Maybe your parents were refugees. Maybe you just became interested in it because you saw it in the news. But I want everyone, if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself and say what your first experience with refugee issues was, where it took place, and how it impacted you. And it's not obligatory, so of course if you prefer not to, that's absolutely fine. But I thought it would be a nice way to break the ice a little bit and get to know each other in this room. So I don't think we'll need a microphone, but there might be. Sorry, I'll just use this one. If people want to use a microphone.
Hello everyone, I'm Sushila and I'm from Nepal. So I'm associated with Inuit International in Nepal. So my first experience working with the refugees was as soon as I entered Inuit as an intern. I got opportunity to travel to refugee camps in Pokhara, that's in Kaski. So when I went there, actually we went there in a team to see how they are coping with the situations, be it their livelihood or economic situations. So there were many myths, like people thought that refugees, Tibetan refugees are rich, and they were saying like normal people, local people think that we are rich, but actually we don't have any kind of like where we can save the money, so we own on ourselves. So local people think that we are rich. So in that point I thought like how we can clear the myths. So that point impacted me, like okay, we need to sensitize people also in Nepal as well. So since then I've been working at Inherit and with the issues of refugees as well. So thank you, I think.
Hello everyone, it's me Jyoti Tiwari from Nepal. Previously I had heard a lot about refugees and their problems. In Nepal we had Bhutanese refugees, and before 2 years or last year we had Rohingyas, that they were like entering from Bangladesh or somewhere like it's from India, and we protested in favor of their rights, because we saying that no, they are human and they have human rights and government should help them. And later in Nepal they entered few, and they are struggling. And I don't have much experience with refugees, but we just advocate for their rights. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ruta. I'm from India, and I'm working with this organization called Migration and Asylum Project. So earlier I used to do very different work, but I've just started this year. And my first experience with refugees or other asylum seekers has been with the family from Afghanistan. During my first couple of weeks at work, I was trying to work with them to understand their case, because as in they had not been granted refugee status. So it was basically trying to speak to them, understand their case, and it was a very new experience for me. And I had followed up with reading up a lot about their country and the situation they're coming from. So that was my first experience, and it's had quite an impact.
Hello everyone, I'm Carmen from the Philippines. I am an anthropologist by passion and profession. I'm associated with Amnesty International Philippines and the National Union of People's Lawyers. In the Philippines, we don't have refugees, but we have a lot of internally displaced people. And most of the IDPs in our country are indigenous peoples. And as an indigenous woman myself, I think that it is it should be one of my advocacies to fight for the rights. So ever since, I've been engaged in programs that target IDPs, especially when they're driven out as a result of militarization, development aggression, and commercialization. So yeah.
Hello everybody, good morning. My name is Rokwanuddin. I work as a research associate with the United Nations Development Program in Bangladesh, and I'm based in Cox's Bazar, the bordering area to Myanmar. And in 2017 we have had over 700,000 Rohingya refugees who infiltrated, exodus to Bangladesh. So it is one of the emerging humanitarian crisis in the world at the current time after Syria. The reason our unit was established is mainly because the talks about refugees evolve around their rights, the status, and something like that. But Bangladesh is not signatory of the refugee protocol or refugee conventions. So actually, legally, Bangladesh government is not obliged to maintain those or provide those sort of facilities to the refugees. But that doesn't mean that refugees should not have the rights or the status. So at the instigation of resident coordinator of United Nations, our unit was established to see the implications of the refugee on the host communities and trans-border relations, what's actually happening, the political and economic issues beyond the rights perspective. And the first time I saw refugees coming, the flow I observed was in Sweden. I did my master's there, and that was 2014. At that time, the Syrian refugees were flooded into Europe. So many people think, okay, European countries are rich, and Sweden is much richer. Still, the plight of refugees there I observed, and the language courses as an immigrant there I attended. I heard from there it was like very pathetic, and many of them were highly educated. Oh, sorry, my mouth is from the microphone. So I learned that the well-educated people who had been doing in their countries very well, when became refugees, actually the plight were catastrophic to them and to their families. And after completing the masters, I realized that at that time Rohingya refugee crisis started. I realized that I must have been in my country to help this situation to improve. That's why I returned and joined United Nations Development Program. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Meda Zagorac. I'm from Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, we have a lot of experience with refugees because we were actually in war during the 90s after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and a lot of people from Bosnia and Herzegovina are refugees, and a lot of my family members are refugees and they are living in other countries. But apart from that, now Bosnia and Herzegovina is a country on a path of Balkan route for refugees and migrants who are trying to enter the European countries. And basically, Bosnia and Herzegovina was totally unprepared for that. Even we are totally aware that was about to happen. And now the international community is working with the migrants and refugees, but our administration system is very complicated, so sometimes they don't even know how to provide exact information for those people. A lot of activities, a lot of activists are working on field with migrants, and they are trying to give their best to provide basic human rights. And there is a lot of hate crimes and hate speech towards migrants and refugees in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's a big issue, and it's something that we must work on really hard in order to I don't know, I would just like people to realize that they somehow forgot that they were in the same situation 20 years ago. So basically, it is something that we must work on really hard. And I haven't said that, but I'm working in the network for building peace, and I have the opportunity to discuss and communicate with activists from 185 organizations from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I have the opportunity to connect them, give them information, to work with them, and I have the information from field. So that's why it's very important for me to be here, to learn as much as I can learn, and to provide them the right and exact information in order for them and for me as well to provide adequate assistance and help for refugees and migrants in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
So I request people don't share my information because I've never shared with any large group. I'm a refugee myself. I left China, so I'm a Uyghur, so left China many years ago, not intending to become a refugee. So I left for education purposes, but after a few years, it became too dangerous for me to go back. After I finished my master's degree, I decided to stay in Australia. I'm very lucky, got my refugee status there, and now I live there. So my first experience is I'm a refugee myself, but I never shared it with large group of people. Only my close friends know about it because it will cause great danger to my family, and my family doesn't know how I, decided to stay here. I always tell them I'm studying and working. So that's my first experience, and after that I worked for an NGO in Sydney called Settlement Services International with people who arrived Australia by boat. I worked there for 4 years as a case worker. So I did a lot of work in government structure because our money was coming from Australian government, and I did some advocacy work myself. I have certain understanding about the refugee asylum seeker policies in Australia, which is very, very harsh and unfriendly towards asylum seekers. So I'm here to share my experience and learn from all of you great guys. Thank you. So nervous.
Hello, I'm Paula. I'm from Brazil. Nice to meet you all. Well, I work for United Nations Environment Program, and my experience with refugees is that most recently, I'm a CCCM specialist, camp management and camp coordination. And in 2018, I was in the Venezuelan border, and I was working directly in the camp for Venezuelan refugee, which is really interesting because it's something that is happening in South America, and is a different type of refugee. It's not something that you can apply completely into the international refugee law. So this is really difficult to address, and that's the experience that I have. And I'm currently I returned to the city that I was working before, now for another mission at UN, but I'm still working with refugees, but now I'm a volunteer and I'm working in another type of project with them, now trying to get them based and finding job and finding a new life in the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. So this is my experience. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Shafira from Indonesia, and I'm working for Search for Common Ground. My first experience with refugees actually quite similar to Rukun. I was studying in the UK when it was the European refugee crisis, and with several other volunteers from England, we volunteered in a refugee camp in Calais, France. So there was around 6,000, 7,000 refugees there in an emergency refugee camp that were actually trying to cross to the UK to apply for asylum there. And it was a very life-changing experience and one of my first introductions into the issue. And after completing my studies, I went back to Indonesia and tried to find out more about the situation of refugees in Indonesia. And even though the refugees in Indonesia are not in an emergency situation, but it's not less bad because that they're living in limbo for more than like 4 or 5 years, because Indonesia is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. And so in basically Indonesia, around 14,000 refugees don't have basic rights. And I've been working with refugee-led initiatives to advocate for refugees and access basic services like education. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ayu, also from Indonesia. I'm actually an academic, so I work at the university, so I'm not an activist professionally. My interest in refugee issue came in 2015 when I started to work for research about the Rohingya in Malaysia. So because of the research, I did a couple of field work in Malaysia with the Rohingya communities. Started from there. I'm getting interested in not only write their experience or their case with theories, but I also am interested in how can I contribute more in a more direct way. So I started last year. I got in contact with refugee communities in Indonesia. So first I started in Malaysia, but then I think I should contribute to refugees in Indonesia as well. So I got in contact with the refugee communities in Indonesia, and that's how I got to know her as well, because basically there's only a couple or few refugee communities in Indonesia. And my focus is on the social mobilization or self-empowerment of these refugees. Being in contact with these refugee organizations and how they work to self-sufficient their needs is very interesting, and that's how I got into this issue. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Fajar. I'm the third Indonesian here. So I'm working for a government office, the National Commission of Human Rights. And I reside at Palu city, which just recently got struck by disaster. So most of my work in Palu is about naturally induced IDPs, and also some of IDPs induced by social conflicts in that region. But my first experience regarding the refugees is actually quite different about that. So I've worked independently with some of my friends, working with some Turkish teachers working in Indonesia, but then they just got their citizenship and visas revoked because their affiliation is actually the opposition of Erdogan. So they're basically just like middle school, basic school teachers. So we work with the current legal system in Indonesia, which is actually quite hard and quite clueless about this case. Well, that's all I think that I have.
Hi everyone, I'm Evan from Thailand/Australia. My first experience with refugees was about 10 years ago. I was actually visiting a friend in Hong Kong who at the time was volunteering with an Apron member organisation. I didn't know anything about refugees. I was completely clueless, so I kind of fell into it by chance. I just got interested in the sort of stories and the sort of passion this person had, and understanding how there was a complete lack of legal frameworks for refugees in Hong Kong. I also got to meet some of the community there, so at that point in time there was a large Togolese population in Hong Kong, and hearing some of their personal stories sort of really had a personal impact. So I went back to Australia, finished my Masters, then moved to Asia, where I've stayed since. So I've been working with refugees probably for the better part of the last decade. Thank you.
I'm going to speak without the mic. My name is Jackson Robert. I'm from South Sudan, and currently I'm working in Somalia with African Union. In terms of my experience with the refugees, I myself was a refugee for 16 years in Central African Republic. So when I came back to South Sudan in 2016, I started working with UNICEF, WFP, and USAID. All my work has been with refugees and IDPs. And now in Somalia, I work with the mission. It's a mission that is deployed under Chapter 7, which is peace enforcement, not peacekeeping. We have forces from different 5 African nations who are fighting with Al-Shabaab to bring peace and stability to Somalia. But then we have the civilian part of the mission, that's the military operation. When the military recovers an area, the civilian go in to assist with the issues to do with civil affairs, human rights issues, but also there is the aspect of humanitarian assistance. And I work as a humanitarian liaison officer to coordinate and implement some projects in areas where there are no humanitarian actors, because in Somalia, IDPs prefer to be closer to the African Union mission for purpose of security, because when they're outside, they could be targeted by Al-Shabaab. And in areas where there are no humanitarian actors, the mission becomes the sole responder. And that's when we go in to assist refugees with the different projects, from water, food, and non-food items. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing about all of this, and I appreciate the candidness that people bring. And one of the reasons that I like the idea of asking people about their first experience is that often people will introduce themselves and say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I work for," and so you learn about their current experience, but I always wonder what brings people into this. And I think it's really compelling. Like Evan said, once you start talking to communities, all of a sudden you realize how important these issues are and how human they are. Or if you have a history, like in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where there was this refugee past, and now you're trying to deal with a refugee present, or you have a teacher who becomes a refugee, a friend, a colleague. These are very personal and connected experiences. And for me, I think my very first engagement with a refugee was in Nepal. And I met Tibetans, and I didn't know why the Tibetans were there. I was about 10 years old, 8, 9, something like that. And I started to hear this word refugee, and I started to understand that I could travel. I have an American passport. In terms of the global lottery of passports, I'm doing quite well. I can travel very easily, but my Nepali friends had trouble, and my Tibetan friends couldn't travel at all. They couldn't visit me. So I remember that was, as a child, a very influential experience. And it started to make me think a lot about the politics of borders, the politics of movement, the politics of belonging, and the politics of home, that were all really influential to me as a child. I didn't know it at the time. I can only imagine that that's what's influenced me now to do the work that I do. But really it was, as I mentioned, it was Rwanda. And going there in 1996, when the genocide had ended, about 1 million people had been pushed into what was then Zaire, and the Rwandan government forced the camps to close and pushed about 800,000 back into Rwanda over the course of about 5 days. And it occurred to me then, and I was only about 20 years old, it occurred to me then that that dynamic of what happened that weekend and what had happened in the year and a half before would influence the future of all of the Great Lakes, African Great Lakes region for decades to come. That long after I'm dead, there will still be discussions about that refugee movement and the genocide that preceded it. And if you look at the questions of the genocide itself, people often root that to previous refugee movements. So I started to realize just how influential these issues are. And I think it's really interesting to hear from the room the things that came out. One is confidentiality. And that's absolutely essential. And I think that when we work in this field, you learn very quickly why confidentiality is essential. So I do want to reiterate that this is a safe space to talk about things. If you don't want to be filmed, you don't want your picture taken, you don't want anything recorded, just let the May 18 Foundation people know, and they will make sure that that is the case. I'm struck by the dynamism also of the number of organizations and different kinds of organizations. Of course, you have UN organizations, but they're not the traditional refugee organizations. UNEP and UNDP are not UNHCR. So it also shows how refugee issues spread across diverse organizations. We have SSI in the back, we have MAP in the front, we have INHRED in Nepal, we have academics, we have government, Human Rights Commission. These issues are widespread, and they touch on a lot of different areas of organization, of employment, of engagement, And that came out immediately, and this isn't a very large group, but even in this group we have such a diversity of experience. I think it's also interesting to see how people first become aware of these issues in their lives, and one of the things that struck me about the responses that we just had were that at least two of you, your first experience was in Europe. And we don't hear much about refugees in Europe, but it's just as influential when we talk about a place like Sweden or a place like Calais, where you have refugees in countries and economies that are at the top of the global scale. And in those countries, you have just as, if not more, vitriolic conversation about refugees than in any other country in the world. And that those can also be really, really engaging. You don't have to come from a part of the globe that produces refugees to really engage these issues. And oftentimes it's the response to a refugee influx, like in Bangladesh, that can really be something that will engage people. We also talked a lot about terminologies that, when I came this morning, I had no idea who was going to be in the audience. I didn't know whether people would have direct experience with refugees or whether people were new to the subject. But there's a lot of terminology already being used that makes me confident that a lot of you have enough experience with this that you're very familiar with terminologies like non-signatory states or IDPs. These are also issues to explore when we look at why refugees matter, and I'll be doing that a little bit in the lecture. We talk about legal obligations and rights versus humanitarian assistance. Again, refugee issues matter across a wide spectrum. But before I get too wrapped up in discussing the responses in the room, I just find them very interesting. I'll get through this speech and then we'll have more of an opportunity to explore the experiences in the room and the perspectives in the room. So bear with me, it's about 20 minutes long. The topic I was given for this morning is why refugee issues matter, and I think it's a very difficult speech to write, and the reason it's a very difficult speech to write is that there's so many answers to that question. And they're always developing and they're always changing. And I didn't quite know how to focus that. So I've only explored a few here, and I think in the second half of the session we can explore more in a less formal setting. The question of why refugees matter may not at first glance seem to be a complicated one, and at its core it's not. Refugees matter because they're humans. They're mothers and daughters and sons and fathers. They're brothers and sisters and friends and loved ones. Refugees could be and are you and me and the people around us. Refugee issues matter because they highlight our obligation to common humanity. They challenge us to defend and protect people who've been stripped of their core competencies to defend and protect themselves. They matter because they show us that our lives on this planet are shared and that humanity is greater than race and politics and states and governments, and that it's greater than the forces of repression and subjugation and oppression that seek to divide and categorize us all. They show us where we succeed and they show us where we fail. That is the simple question. That's the simple answer to the question of why refugee issues matter. Of course, when you explore it further, the answer becomes much more expansive. Before we start, though, let's situate ourselves and define our basic terms. Let's start by exploring who refugees are, and then I'll say a few words about why all of this is relevant to Gwangju and all of us in this room right now. So first, and I think many of you know this, the answer to this question, who is a refugee? Again, it's a complicated one, though. We start to think we know it, and then when we start to explore it, we realize that it's much more complicated than the definitions that exist. Who is a refugee? What does it mean to be a refugee? The easy answer, the traditional answer, the answer that you'll get on the street, is that a refugee is someone fleeing danger and seeking safety. That's the historical answer to that question. The concepts of refuge and sanctuary are at the core of human history. They weave themselves through mythology, and define the fundamental principle at the root of nearly every major global religion. Christianity places the story of Jesus seeking sanctuary from Pharaoh as central to its teaching, and the most holy location in the church is its sanctuary. In Islamic law, the concept of aman provides for an inviolable obligation to provide refuge to non-Muslims in need, even if those in need are battling the Islamic faith. The Prophet Muhammad, like Jesus, was a refugee, fleeing Mecca with his followers to escape persecution, and was sheltered by a Christian king in Abyssinia, and the right to seek asylum is underscored in the Quran. The Buddhist concept of karuna places compassion for self and others in need as one of the 4 divine abodes of the mind. And in the Jewish Torah, welcoming the persecuted is one of the most important tenets, reaching back to biblical times. So these concepts go way back. The international legal structure that currently serves to define who a refugee is and outlines the rights of persecuted people emerged in the early 20th century, relatively recently. The League of Nations, precursor to the UN, appointed Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian explorer and diplomat, the first commissioner for refugees. It's the first official international title for someone working around refugee issues. Nansen was charged with solving the problem of Russian refugees dispersed across Europe in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. He created a single office within the League of Nations, staffed only by himself, and set about the task of determining how best to address the needs of people exiled by a hostile and persecutory regime. He determined it as a first step, a fundamental concern, and that was the lack of a legal status, the lack of a recognition. Who is a refugee? And what does it mean to be a refugee? And if you are a refugee, what should you be entitled to? How do you gain what those entitlements are? Rights are legal. They're based in law. The idea of protection is fundamentally an idea of state obligation and accountability. Refugees are a population without a state. They fall outside of law, and therefore they fall outside of rights. Nansen saw this as a core challenge to refugees, and so it remains today, as many of you will know who work in rights. In the aftermath of World War II, when people were scattered across Europe, the League of Nations was transformed into the United Nations, of which we are all very familiar and of which some of us are employees. The first act of the United Nations, after recognizing the state of Israel, an action itself based in refugees, was to draft in 1950 a convention to address the issue of popular displacement and to establish the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. At that point, it was also a singular person. Now it's massive, as many of you know. The office was designed to address the needs of refugees across Europe and to dissolve and disappear in 3 years. That means that UNHCR was designed to not exist anymore in 1954. It was charged with upholding its mandate to assist governments in implementing the international legal protections guaranteed by the convention the newly formed United Nations had set itself to drafting, which many of you will know is the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. The 1951 Convention defined the rights of refugees based in the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, another term many of which you'll know. The protection of any person from return to a persecutory authority. It also determined who is a refugee and therefore eligible for protection under its mandate. The definition of a refugee under the convention is a terrifically cumbersome, confusing, and lengthy exercise in legal language. A refugee is any person who, quote, as a result of events occurring before 1st of January 1951 and owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. I need a drink after that. It's clearly a problematic definition. It's hard enough just to read it, but it remains the determinant of criteria for receiving protection under international law as a refugee. Let's examine some of the problematics. Firstly, it defines refugees as people who fled before 1951. So anyone who fled after 1951 is not a refugee, according to this definition. Clearly, persecution did not end on a calendar date. Secondly, it restricted refugees to people who fit a particular nexus requirement, facing a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of 5 fairly rigid categories. Thirdly, although this is mentioned in a subsequent article, it limited refugees to people fleeing events in Europe before 1951. So anyone outside of Europe was not a refugee. Anybody who fled after 1951 was not a refugee, and you were not a refugee if you didn't fit one of those 5 categories and could demonstrate a nexus to persecution. In 1951, the most progressive refugee policy on the planet, arriving at a time of global sympathy for refugees, defined refugees in time and space and was meant to dissolve within 3 years. The refugee problem was seen as one that would be rapidly solved, and the UNHCR quickly decommissioned. Needless to say, the newly established office of the UNHCR did not dissolve in 3 years, nor was it able to solve the issue of refugees in 3 years. It continues to struggle with that challenge, and is now, nearly 70 years later, one of the UN's largest agencies. It does, however, continue to have a mandate under international law to identify refugees and to work to guarantee their protection. The criteria that determine who qualifies for protection as a refugee under law were expanded by a number of international conventions and declarations. Some of you who come from different regions will be familiar with these and may have used these in your advocacy work. In the 1967 protocol relating to the status of refugees erased the geographic and temporal restrictions on the initial definition. The 1969 OAU Convention expanded the definition further, but only in Africa. The 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees instituted protection for people in Latin America fleeing generalized violence, which was a huge expansion of the limited protections granted by the 1951 Convention. Asia remains without a framework. The vast majority of Asian nations have not obliged themselves to international frameworks for protection or implemented domestic laws addressing refugees. Refugees in Asia remain without the core construct Nansen identified: legal recognition and protection under law. Refugees in most Asian states have no rights and have no recourse to access rights. Refugees in Asia remain invisible, and in many countries, refugees are not, legally speaking, people. This is not the case in South Korea. And perhaps here we can shift to why this place is an important one to consider refugee issues and the struggle for refugee rights. South Korea signed the 1951 Refugee Convention back in 1992. And it became the first country in East Asia to enact its own refugee law, which came into force 7 years ago. In this regard, South Korea is a pioneer amongst its neighbors, and it sets an example for the region as a whole. This doesn't mean that being a refugee in South Korea is easy, or the system functions well, but at least there is a system. I'm sure you'll have more opportunities to learn about it over the next 2 weeks, talking with colleagues here, listening to lectures here, engaging with the other people in the room. South Korea has also found itself grappling with its own public debates around refugees in the very recent past. And not far from here, on Jeju Island, which I think all of you get to visit while you're here, which I'm envious of, because I would love to go and see it and talk to people there. Last year, mass protests erupted when about 500 refugees from Yemen claimed asylum on Jeju. The media reaction was widespread, and the public backlash was severe. On this topic as well, I know you'll have a chance to engage in the coming few weeks. But let's situate ourselves here, in Gwangju. This is no insignificant place to discuss defending political dissent. As you will know, between the 18th and 27th of May 1980, citizens of Gwangju took up arms in defense of students protesting against martial law. More than 600 people were killed demonstrating for progressive change here, not far from this building. The government was forced to respond, and the democratization movement in South Korea was born. Gwangju is famous for this history and the legacy of ordinary people no different than any of us in this room, and with just as much to lose, standing up for recognition. The Gwangju protesters faced the violence of the forces determined to suppress that recognition, and even now, the distortion of that history seeks to undermine it. Even in the elevator as I came up to this floor, I heard about the removal of this history from textbooks in South Korea. To those of you less familiar with the history of Gwangju, you will surely become more acquainted with this fundamentally formative moment in the history of self-determination here. Gwangju's place in that long history of human action towards self-determination is a significant one, and it's linked to refugees and to their efforts in a multitude of ways. We need to see that these histories are linked together and hold them together and learn from them. We need to understand the precarity of our freedoms, draw from past movements, and build on the linkages between ourselves and others. Struggle links Gwangju to refugees. Protesters become refugees, and refugees protest. Refugees have protested for as long as efforts to silence and persecute them have existed. Refugee protest is some of the most dramatic, desperate, and spectacular. Instances of self-immolation, slow public starvation, riotous violence are not rare. But public response and research has been limited at best on this. Simultaneously, refugee protests can be quiet, unnoticed, isolated, and very lonely. Late night solitary suicides and disappearances from routines that hardly recognize the absence. Coping with the harsh conditions of life in exile, institutional and otherwise, is an inherent component of the refugee experience, and a component that, as trends toward restrictive asylum policy grow, increasingly incorporates protest. Like in Gwangju in 1980, at some point, the balance tips. Resistance in exile has become a tool of identity for refugees as well, a vehicle through which feelings of agency can be achieved, cultural values can be maintained, a sense of worth can be created, and perhaps most importantly, a feeling of movement, some semblance of momentum and validity can be realized in what are often prolonged, stifling, powerless situations of physical and emotional constraint. Even the act of becoming a refugee, one could argue, is itself an act of resistance, a countermeasure to increasingly hostile and unbearable conditions. The very nature of existence as a refugee is dynamically polarized. On the one hand, refugees belong to a community, a greater category of refugees who share the common situational context of seeking international protection from threatening circumstances. On the other hand, refugees are isolated and often removed from social and cultural support networks, and they're at the mercy of unfamiliar organizations, challenging local contexts, and hostile host nation policies. Language barriers accentuate this separation and lead to an inability to express despair, frustration, and a lack of understanding in familiar and effective ways. Theorists in refugee psychology identify common patterns of refugee response to exile. And these often include reclusive behavior, mourning periods, depression, anger. But refugees have no avenue to regularize their lives. They're not citizens. They can't appeal to citizen protections. They can't approach the law. If they protest against the state hosting them, they risk losing their security in that state and being returned to their fates. If they protest against host societies, they're vilified, and xenophobia and hate crimes grow. If they protest against UNHCR or other international organizations charged with their maintenance, they protest in vain. These organizations are not states. They can't guarantee refugees protection. They can't make policy. They can't ensure any positive future. And they're beholden to the states that host them. This does not mean that refugee protests do not continue. They are numerous. At this moment, any number of refugee protests are ongoing across the globe, many in this region and some very nearby. Some, like those around detention centers in Australia, where refugees sew their own mouths shut to demonstrate their lack of voice. Some are hunger strikes, like in Indonesia currently, and maybe Shafira can say a little bit about that at some point today. Some are violent and quickly suppressed. The media rarely reports on these. And where they do, it tends to be negative reporting. Otherwise, we never hear about them. These protests are linked to this place and to this institute. They carry on the passion and determination of Gwangju and any number of other movements for basic human respect and communality that have marked history. But they are the unsung histories, and that links them to this moment. That's why they're essential for us to engage and to support. They're movements of a common humanity for which we are all accountable. Refugee issues matter to everyone. Refugee issues are some of the most divisive on the planet. I've dedicated my life up to this point to defending refugees and advancing fundamental human freedoms. Refugee issues also matter to people who have dedicated their lives to isolationism and nationalism, whose ideologies are bonded to concepts of racial superiority and sustaining economic inequality. Refugee issues matter to artists and writers who see a better future in rich aesthetic understanding of human experiences of exile. They matter to economists who gauge refugee presence in terms of net national product. They matter to students who use refugees as gateways to understanding global state structures of trauma, psychology, and humanitarianism. They matter to philosophers who ponder concepts of identity and belonging through the lens of otherized populations. They matter to academics who build careers examining the ideological underpinnings of social theory around refugees. Most of all, refugee issues matter to refugees. Refugees have the most to gain and the most to lose. And refugees' lives depend on how all of us engage with that experience. Let me underscore the severity of that statement. Some years ago, when I was working as a lawyer defending refused asylum seekers in the British courts, I was approached by one of my mentors. She looked me in the eyes directly and she said, "Themba, you can't get this wrong." I looked back at her, not really understanding what she meant. The only difference between a refugee deportation case and a death row case, she continued, is that refugees are not criminals. But the system has treated them that way. While these may be called immigration removal proceedings in court, make no mistake, these cases are death row cases. If the judge rules against you, your client is in dire trouble. Needless to say, this did not help my confidence or stress level in that particular job, but it does focus the severity of the stakes at hand for refugees. Refugee issues matter because if we ignore them or we get them wrong, we're complacent in maintaining structures that devastate people's lives, that silence minorities, that undermine pluralistic diversity, and that allow torture and death. Refugee issues matter across the spectrum of human experience. And I'd like to examine just a few of the areas influenced, if not defined, by refugee issues. Let's start with global politics. It's an obvious one. The issue of refugees is the oldest international political issue in recorded history. Prominently displayed in the main entrance to the United Nations building in New York, maybe some of you have been there, is a copy of the Treaty of Kadesh. The treaty was carved in stone in hieroglyphics and in Hittite in 1259 BC. It's an agreement between Egypt and the Hittite kingdom, which is now in sort of Syria, Turkey area. The treaty is the oldest recorded agreement between states in history and the first known instance of agreed international law. The first clause of this treaty ends the conflict between the two states. The second clause, number 2, more prominent than any other in the text, is a sworn commitment by each state to extradite the other's political dissidents. These political dissidents in exile were refugees. Refugees are the core feature in the first interstate treaty on the planet. There's no formal documentation of the refugees' response to their extradition, but we can only imagine it was protestation. Refugee issues have mattered for a long time. Refugee issues matter because they continue to define global political debates. Refugee issues drive popular support for international policy. They instill fear and hope and fuel massive popular movements, both in protest of refugees and in their defense. In the last 2 years, thousands upon thousands of people have marched in Spain, Germany, the UK, the United States, Mexico, and across the world to demonstrate their discontent with policies that build walls, vilify migrants, and punish with criminal charges people who rescue refugees at sea, acting as any human would to save lives. They come out in their thousands to defend refugees. At the same time, marchers have gone to the streets across the world to protest refugees, including here, where protests erupted around the presence of a few hundred Yemeni refugees on Jeju Island. Last week in my city, Portland, Oregon, white nationalists marched in support of draconian immigration rules that cage the children of asylum seekers, separate their families, and block recognition of refugees from a number of Islamic countries. The marchers demanded that the president designate their opposition, an anti-fascist group known as Antifa, as a terrorist organization, thereby criminalizing the primary direct action resistance to the white nationalist movement. The president announced his administration would consider it. Politicians bargain their futures and base their campaigns on singling out refugees as an existential threat to the very identity of their constituencies, even when refugee populations comprise less than 1% of the national populace, contribute considerably to cultural and social vibrancy, and are barred from engaging in political discourse. Heads of state spar and battle to define new levels of intolerance for exiled populations, vilifying and dehumanizing them with terminology based in threat. Invaders, criminals, terrorists. Refugee issues dominate the media day after day. Pick up any paper and you'll find the refugee debate in the headlines. Ships are pulled back to sea to ensure refugees are unable to land and access their fundamental and universal right to claim asylum. Remote islands are becoming permanent refugee prison camps. Refugees are unable to move forward and unable to go back. Most often, they are also unable to contribute to the discussions around them. This is why refugee issues matter to us. Refugee issues also matter because refugees, by their very existence, raise questions about the nature of humans and the nation state itself. The obligations of non-state actors, such as international agencies, and the universality of universal human rights. The division of humanity into citizenry has fundamentally altered the structure of human existence. A nation state determines who its citizens are and are not, and can then determine whether they are deserving of the benefits of its protection. But this can only happen in opposition to a non-citizen, someone somewhere else who is effectively, in terms of that nation state, not of any concern whatsoever. States are then charged with protecting the rights of their citizens, but not the citizens of somewhere else. The theory being that the citizens of State A will be protected by State A, and the citizens of State B will be protected by State B. The protection of human rights, therefore, depends not on belonging to a common humanity, but on holding citizenship. Refugee issues matter because they present a paradox. If human existence is categorized into citizenships, and the assurance of rights exists only between a state and its citizens, to whom can a non-citizen appeal for protection of inalienable human rights? Refugees as non-citizens point directly to our failure to actualize universal and fundamental human rights. Hannah Arendt is a political philosopher, descendant of German refugee ancestry, very prolific in the 1970s. Put it this way: human rights were defined as inalienable because they were supposed to be independent of all governments. But it turned out that the moment human beings lacked their own government and had to fall back upon their minimum rights, no authority was left to protect them, and no institution was willing to guarantee them. That remains the case. This is the paradox of refugee rights. Refugee rights demonstrate that human rights need to be independent from governments and fundamentally human, but they're not. Refugee issues matter because they are intensely political. States can point to refugee numbers to demonstrate the failure of an adversarial state and boost their own political righteousness. The United States welcomed refugees from Cuba while feuding with the communist regime, but refused them from Haiti, only marginally different in terms of the actual circumstances faced. Refugees can be celebrated as freedom fighters or as terrorists, depending on where you sit on the political spectrum. Discussion of international burden sharing, an unfortunate phraseology, quickly lays bare hostile political realities. The fact that refugees are, by definition, an international phenomenon makes these politics bleed into larger geopolitical relationships, as I'm sure our colleague from South Sudan can attest. The fact that refugees are, by definition, an international phenomenon also shapes the futures of whole continents for decades to come. Just look at Palestine, Israel, Rwanda, Congo, Syria, Turkey, Myanmar, Bangladesh, just to name a few. Refugee issues matter because they will evolve, they are ever-changing, and they will continue for as long as humans organize themselves in opposition to each other. A law professor of mine once sat with me in a courtyard at my university when I was studying in Cairo some years ago. And we were discussing, among other things, my distaste for law, but we were discussing the refugee definition under international law. And in specific, why there was a category for people facing persecution for belonging to, quote, a particular social group. The category seemed so out of place and vague in comparison to the others. Race, religion, nationality, and political opinion, those are fairly well defined. Still problematic, but fairly well defined. He told me that during the drafting of the convention in 1950, the particular social group category had been added on at the last moment through, I think, an intervention from Poland, but I can't remember exactly. Through a specific intervention by one of the drafters. It's vague, my professor told me. And it's vague so that it can be adaptable. The drafters realize that humans are ingenuitive and that we'll never stop thinking of new and more insidious ways to persecute each other. And the convention needed to recognize that. So refugee issues matter because they will continue to matter. Refugee issues matter because the sources of persecution will continue to be redefined. Refugee issues matter because that continuation is the continuation of the erosion of our human links to each other. all of you here at the May 18 Academy, all of you are here at the May 18 Academy because on some level, or to some degree, all of you are interested in refugee issues as we've determined. Perhaps you work closely with refugee populations, and some of you do. Perhaps you have no experience with refugees or drawn to the topic otherwise. I don't think that's the case. Perhaps you are, or have been, or someday will be, refugees. We all have the potential to become refugees. Many of us come from backgrounds that include refugees, and we will continue to see the creation of refugees. So, why do refugees matter? Why do refugee issues matter? The answer to this question is not for me to determine and pass on to you. The answer to this question is one for you to explore together today, together tomorrow, together for the next 2 weeks, in your quiet time, with your friends, with your families, with the people you work with, and to continue to examine for a long future to come. What I would like to do now, since you've all been so patient and suffered through my long speech, is to take a break for a little bit, and then when we come back, we're going to divide into groups and do a little bit of a more personal exploration, I think, a more intimate exploration among the people in the room of our own experience and why we think refugees matter. So you can start thinking about these questions during the break. Basically, what I'm hoping is that we can explore why refugees matter, what role refugees play in progressing positive change in the world, and what our role is and how we can best act to realize a world in which refugees are protected and the conditions that create refugees are alleviated. But of course, because I also want this to be an autonomous group, I want these groups to work together to come up with and identify your own questions about why we're here over the course of the next 2 weeks, what we can gain out of the experience of being here over the next 2 weeks, and what we can learn from each other. But let's stop for a break until, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes from now. We can call people back at the latest at 11:15. If people get finished with the break earlier, we can start a little bit earlier. But let's take just a 20 or 30 minute break. There's coffee, bathroom breaks, etc. Hello everybody. I know it's not quite time for our break to end yet, but I'm going to exercise the executive privilege of having a microphone to try and call us all back together. I've just been informed we actually have to end a little bit earlier than I had thought. So we may still be missing a few people, but I'm sure they will come in. So what I'd like to do now, and this desk arrangement is not perfect for it, but I'm sure we can figure it out, is we're about 13 or 14 people. I thought we could divide up into 2 groups, and it doesn't really matter to me about how we divide up, perhaps this side of the room and this side of the room. And to talk about these 4 questions. They're very broad, but they're broad on purpose. They're broad so that there's a lot of room for us to explore where the conversation takes us. And I'm not sure, that we'll come to an answer of these, but I just want to explore these questions a bit, and we'll do that for 20 minutes. And then we'll come back together and have half an hour where there could be a report back a little bit from what your groups talked about, and then we can just open it for discussion, because it's selfish of me, but I just want to hear about your experiences and why you're here and why you're doing this, and I think that that's really going to drive the real answer to that first question. So if you wouldn't mind, we could pull chairs. If you want to sit in a circle, you can pull chairs from the back, and maybe somebody could take some notes, appoint someone who wants to take some notes, and would be able to present some of the reflections that came out of the 2 groups. And I would suggest we just divide by the side of the room because it's fairly randomized. And we can talk in groups for about 20 minutes, and then I'll call everyone back together. Sound good? All right, great.
We're sharing the same colleague. I'm Pancha and I'm a colleague.
Yeah, if there's an imbalance, we can feel free to move around.
You know, like Alcoholic Anonymous? You know Alcoholic Anonymous?
Because I can't give you are
No? Not at all.
I'm not kidding.
No, I'm not a drinker.
No, that. Yeah,
No, I'm not a drinker.
It's traditional drink. Yeah, and Makoni.
Yes, sure.
Oh yeah.
You want to come here?
Come in. We need one for sale. One person can join us.
Also, just to let people know, if you get stuck, and I doubt you will, but if you get stuck, I do have some questions that might spur further conversation. So just let me know.
This one, guys.
How many we say? Two?
Even in my place to work on this morning. Yes, 4 a.m.
6 hours.
4 hours, 6 hours. Yeah.
My mom is like seeing the soap opera right now. At the end of the day. What are you doing? I'm trying to be out.
People will always find like maybe reasons to persecute or to further eliminate also like new
Some points, yeah. We can write the key points.
and with the consideration of climate change, it also becomes like a factor that drags people away from their homes. So basically, like that, reasons.
Okay.
That causes of population and environmental conflicts and or yeah.
Should be wider education. Should matter more than ever. In my mind, I mean, I think with all the money we will get large, it should matter first.
Yes.
Because then different. Enough people talking to a lot more about Asia here. But I think we're seeing general progression. Things are going backwards, and I think that's what we need to really keep up with. With India, for instance, you had people with refugees that have been asked to leave, Iran, etc. The protest seems such an issue of practice. All of a sudden, refugees come down, run away to Europe. And it just becomes such a those issues.
Yeah, we
I think it really
for example, during the time when we express women, or religious children,
some people do
understand. So it has how to say, some impact on the human race, because once people understand, they'll be exposed to so many sort of danger. So it's also something to do with humanity.
People having different issues regarding the refugee status, for example, women, people with disabilities, LGBTI persons. So, yeah.
And even we was talking about the law. Why refugee migrants is because they are not protected by law. Law does not. It's a it's like Tom Hanks' movie, The Terminal. To me, the first thing that I saw is like, okay, who am I? Where do I belong? So it's not fair that you have to belong to a certain territory. If you're a part of this community, you should be protected as well as the others. And to me, it matters because of that.
And it should be universal, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
But it's not.
Basically, I think why refugees
Refugee
because they're human.
Yeah.
Basically because the existence of refugee itself is already a sign, a signifier of like something that happened in the region they're originally from. And usually, for example, like refugees from Middle East, they became refugees because of conflict, but it's mostly due to the proxy war. So basically, this refugee sign that there's a conflict that entangles a lot of countries around the world, and that makes them obligated to accept refugees, perhaps like is it appropriate to say this, like a lost cause to the countries that are either directly or indirectly responsible for the conflict that happened in their region, like the state, like the states. The states, for example.
But it's, to me, we have a lack of love.
People who are competing like Saudi Arabia, Iran, they're actually also a proxy of a bigger power like China, Russia, States,
They are not having their economic rights preserved, and this is like unacceptable.
So the reason why refugee matters because these countries are obligated because they're the ones who host it.
There's an argument that whoever is for example, Bangladesh, the Rohingyas are refugees in Bangladesh. But Bangladesh is refugee in India. That means he is a citizen of the country could be refugee to the neighboring countries or other countries. So it matters because some of our old
Exactly, consequence, not lost cause, consequence.
Citizenship community could be refugees to other countries. It matters to us because if we protect other refugees and make that a standard for other countries, then our brothers and sisters could be protected in other countries.
Yeah, and you're mentioning a very interesting awesome aspect. For instance, I forgot your name, I'm so sorry. You are local. Victoria, you are right. I'm so sorry. I'm Carmen. I was really impressed with your lecture, with your speech, because you mentioned something that people do not plan, which is traditional. And this is maybe like why refugee issues matter, but why social issues matter more than whether or not, well, for example, we have to go and we have discussed that because sometimes you don't feel connected with the law and with the community that you are around. And this is hard to protect it and we are dealing with communities and religion and culture. And it's also an aspect. You don't have to be in a country because you like a refugee. Once the towards integration, also further by healthcare policy and
We came from a country, and there was French. So the education system is completely different. And when we
caused a bigger need to push stronger
big issue of economy didn't want it because they said we have to align national curriculum. And yet in the mind of refugees, they wanted their children to get the same education system as us. So that when they come back so that's why the second issue of moving
that you create a certain amount of right to get your official needs potentially create those important changes and programs changes like might create right so like a lot of structure data policies about how to get the community leaders and the information that is of course projects have been going on
I can get for you.
You go to another country, you have to learn a new language. Of course, you can't just survive by just saying you have to put them through education, look for other economic opportunities. But the problem is that right after this and everything, they're ordered or they're involuntarily forced to go back to their countries.
Yeah, I think basically the point is
in terms of the economic leverage, we have cultural aspect, language being first.
One of the things that have been here that has been going on in the last few years is that there has been so because of the gap with between no policy, like no government response and no policy increase the gap for refugees and services to so as a result, a number of refugees have stepped up and created ways to like respond to this group. So like for example, there are almost like 10 learning centers and different conversations that are run and initiated by and then there is like a information center so you should be yourself where to refugees that has also been going on not only providing information but also like getting packages
I don't know about your case, but also like at the forefront of trying was wrong because I'm from Australia, but I will explain you later. And that was really interesting because then you mentioned everything in another place.
I think the question is about like what can this refugee do to the host country? And when they emigrate. Well, that's what I feel.
There are not very more well addressed they can be like confined to situation in the community itself, but also probably like because refugees and Australians, they're not only contributing to the other sites, but also like
It's very interchangeable. But that's also what concerns me, especially about cultural incompatibility.
Sorry for mentioning your case.
You know the case,
I was really impressed by
I think it's quite cliche to point this out, like, you know the conflict that happened between the immigrants and the natives in Europe, the Muslim immigrants, like the wife case. I know it's more like an exaggerated case, where like women in Cologne, Germany, claim that they got raped by some,
for example, the Rohingya
Muslim immigrants.
Once that was
Yeah,
separate,
right.
culturally it's very similar.
But that
it's not the other people.
whether it's true or not, but that
Balkans were
actually
coming to Sweden.
points out
Maybe they're
my concern
same
that
people by religion,
somehow
by history,
that
by
there could be
cultural
like
background,
cultural
that there are
compatibility.
connections.
So this is refugees in the whole country. Same thing happened in Norway. Norway, which the country tried to amend this up by holding classes to Middle East immigrants about the cultures of Norway, the norm of Norway, because most of these immigrants have what conservative value, what conservative perspective. No, I think I think it includes what in that question. It's the issue in that question. It's not the answer. I mean, it's the other thing that includes in the question.
Because like I think that it's still okay, like biggest number of them they don't want to think about it, but some of them will think about it. So what's the problem with that? We should provide like assistance.
I mean, like, yeah, it could be host country, it could be transit countries, it could be like the international.
Sometimes they bring us
Shouldn't exist. Why do I have to be, oh, I can only go to China, I can only go to Darfur, I can only go to Sudan or South Sudan.
Yeah.
Come on, I'm a citizen of the world. Why do I have to choose?
Political boundaries.
Yeah, come on. This is like, what is the problem if I'm white living in another country? Oh, my heritage. Everyone has a different heritage. Everyone has a mix of cultures.
Because before we had like refugees studying with children, like in the poor countries and so on, but now the biggest number of migrants, although it's cheap, but anyway, and media likes, yes, and media likes to present it that way.
Yeah.
And now they're writing like, I don't know, when they're writing some very problematic media reports about, I don't know, sexual violence and things. And those are fake news, and like they are sharing people's ethics, very problematic.
Their response to yeah, and this looks to what role do refugees play in progressive policy? I think addressing refugee status and a policy to respond question leads us to promote changes, important changes. Leads us to discuss human rights, to discuss boundaries, to discuss politics, to discuss tolerance, exactly, and respect.
To accept and embrace our differences.
Yeah, and to also open our minds because when you were talking about Europe, I'm not different in you. If you see what my president is telling me, it's even worse to what you have in Europe. And I'm so sorry about that. I did not vote for this, so please don't judge me for that. It's not my fault, okay? I wasn't in refugee camps. Yes, if I could, I would not have president. But anyway, the thing that we're facing nowadays is that we are mixing all the problems that we have, like we think that the refugee is the person that is part of the
I
Islamic.
think the diversity also includes in terms of knowledge and culture, in terms of like values, social values and norms. Because
in our house, and we think that the
could be things like things that you believe as true in your hometown that could be deemed like negatively in other places. So, but by
the refugee
to refugees, this thing could be amended, right? Like the common ground, like especially people, refugees that came from a very that has a high record of human rights violations, but then they seek refuge in other more progressive countries. They usually bring more issues, more depth to do refugee discourse, right? Like, for example, like persecution against women, against rich women. They say that anti-persecution in my home country isn't necessarily physical, but it's more like social exclusion, especially when you are in period, they tend to exclude you somewhere in the house or outside of the family. Yeah, it could bring more death to the international human rights network.
So whereas in the States, you define refugees and migrants
traditionally have to make because they just dissolve basically
and like what you were saying that like there would be a sharing of knowledge and it's inspired social
sort of using my example because like when in some sort of the government is more positive, what would people that
so for instance, refugees that are in countries prevent the like
not getting out.
And you can be also amazed you also have teachers who are able to teach in the schools at the same time
bring this kind of message to the government and we see that refugees in Asia can be
in some places.
So basically, the refugees tend to make the country, the society even more progressive.
When they became sort of start becoming self-sufficient.
They first especially a lot of food. The first advantages of refugees are a lot of food.
well, not the first thing, but
good restaurant.
definitely up there.
I'm sure that's about compared to this, I was reading about the what's the history of that? And all of the top articles were about Yemeni food and Yemeni restaurants.
It's also quite bizarre, right? Like a Yemeni restaurant in a quite far island from Seoul, like Jeju.
Everything's going over here. Still making it good. We didn't run out of things. I figured you'd just be able to answer that. Just leave it to me. I got this.
we're going to make you the view. Doesn't matter where we are from. We are from the same place. We're from the same place. It doesn't matter, right? So what is our role as You're the government.
Government? I'm not the president.
Okay, so basically what are our roles as
Not only because not many countries do that. Those are those things that we do not manage. Maybe the voice of the from the Ugandan authority. But the presence of the refugee camp is also contributing to the economy of the country. You see, we have Canadian Jews and UN agencies, the refugees are also given opportunity to do some creative job. Most indirectly, they are from the country to open the door, and the society, but also with regards to the issues of mutual integration. We have cases now of intermarriage between refugees and the
That's very important.
yeah, diffusing some of the conflict situations.
To spread this on the country, to other people in why sometimes we open up the access to the border, but more importantly, to empower these refugees to with their own source. I mean, like giving them food or clothes doesn't mean that they are empowered, but I think we need more in that sense. They have to support their own, promote us with our privilege. I don't know, to promote to open up the access to promote what is how it's important to discuss and having a message of how I guess telling the story is my primary role. Yeah, I think she's better than
yeah, I am more. Sorry. I saw she right. Okay.
I think broadly we need to make a complex situation tolerant to refugees because it indicates that society overall tolerant.
Especially from the government, especially
within the
very,
that's why they are not tolerant.
a very important role for the government to refugees is guaranteeing services.
That indicates
Because
the overall situation to other
refugees already live in a precarious situation, right? So I think the first thing they want to access with is public services, right? But then after that, when they got settled and everything, another issue is with the social conflicts there, like the xenophobia, the racism and everything. The government also has duties on this to protect them from these attacks. But to achieve that, they have to fulfill all these public obligations first to the refugees, because without this guarantee, the refugee can live in a more precarious way. They can be more impoverished, be more excluded than before. I think that's the first task.
So in that, like relating to what you said, I think our role perhaps is to pull up if you know such things. In order for a report and share this with media, and also for me is to all the world has to be like they also have to have a perspective, like stand up, like go to protests and talk to people because they know about these issues. They cannot see refugees as a threat or it's just threat to like security or state sovereignty,
I think that's reasonable though, because I mean I don't mean to be like I don't mean to be negative, but state government usually thinks quite selfishly. I mean, they think immigrants and refugees as a more like future investment rather than a humanitarian assistance. Even if it is intended to be humanitarian, it tends to be temporary. Like, okay, you can live here for 4 or 5 years, but then you have to go back. Yeah. So
But some
even for
including
me,
myself, I had to write a bicycle
I
for 4
can't
days. Decided
provide the
my
solution
own
or
spontaneous
the best way to that because
took my bike
to change this perspective
back
in the government
to South Sudan.
because
I was still lagging behind, of course, logistical, finance, and
all in all, they only think about
this
themselves.
kind of refugee spontaneous return. How
even
can
though
we support
don't
that? Because
necessarily
in our case,
government
to be
use,
honest, I
which
was
is
running,
very
but it was taking long. And me as a young person who
but
was
also,
recently from
but at the very
there
least,
was
like
nothing
you
I could do
provide
in
counter
campus here and there are jobs that I'm doing.
so like
So
if,
I
for
decided
example,
to come on my own 4 hours.
refugees come to
This is one case, but there are
like,
cases of
impacts
spontaneous
in
return.
terms of like
Who came and when they come, they find
cultural.
first they come reintegration because there is no any assistance. You may get assistance upon arrival. We used to do that in South Sudan. WFP and others will assist you.
All the issues that they have.
But the reintegration package when you come back is not there for spontaneous. Let me show you how can we address this.
How can we use a refugee
finding out what
to
makes
find
different stakeholders.
refugee to me, it's like something that is not. It shouldn't take much time of you as a human being. How can we give this final status? How can we, or the person can come back to their houses, or they have a place to live? You know, how I think we should, our goal is also to help giving the solution as fast as we can, because what we see is like person being a refugee and being in a camp, being in a temporary place for several years, and this is not acceptable, because we have life returning back to their houses. We have a permanent why should I be like temporary, or why should I be a refugee for the rest of my life? I don't have to be like, I have this status now, so why can't we promote and that is why issue of refugees, it's not just a domestic issue, it's an international issue. Because even if we have international solutions,
They're still
they don't coincide with the national structure. So how
But
it's part of the come up with questions. Don't worry about it. It's connected. How can we best that? Promoting durable solutions in giving letters to create we don't have that. So I think for
in some situations, people were caught by suckers. I want to give an example of refugees in Congo.
But also, I think the
I want to give an example of South Sudanese refugees in Congo in the 1990s. They were at the border with Congo. The rebels in South Sudan decided to go there and send everyone back home. Yes, so we went there and ordered the refugees to change rights. Although there were presence of genocide and other people not to prevent that from happening. So if we are proactive in trying to prepare for that, it can be an issue. Again, example of Sudanese refugees came to South Sudan in 2011. They came at it was a spontaneous influx. They came and settled 15 kilometers from the after they have settled, we started now.
So it's more like, what to do when you find like old people coming in. But then they don't have access to education or healthcare,
again,
like that.
this became an issue. So this didn't go because
refugee protection.
UNHCR was commissioning the aid was commissioning. You don't have to you come, you need assistance. So those kind of things really need to
Yes, I want specific laws protecting refugees, but we also need general laws which apply to refugees. So for instance, there's a mention the right of the child to leave their country to decide up to even if they have a refugee. kind of refugee conventions. So how do we hold a couple of people account?
And they
Other
created it,
international
and
conventions
they
we already
were
have.
totally unaware of the things that were happening in Bosnia and
Exactly. One word is
and now we have very
together.
political
Maybe more cohesion and more for each other.
as the members
I
and
had a discussion
people who are working in civil society, like for example in my country, people who are working in NGOs, they have very unfriendly
and actually
opinion about the international stakeholders, and the international organizations are the ones who are actually working with refugees and migrants. They have conflict with them. So we must, even though we don't like them, sometimes we must open up towards them, because we are the ones who are getting the information from the field, and we can provide them exact information. People who are not from our country, they are totally unaware about
Like
things that are
building
happening in our country.
communities, resilience.
We must,
You know, I got this principle from post-disaster classes. Usually it's about when it's like building the community to be more cohesive than before, more to be more resilient into not only like natural disaster but also possibility of social conflicts, forced displacement and everything like that. So basically making community to be more rely on each other, to be more but also at the same time open to possibilities and open to progression, especially in terms. Actually, I think it can be used on refugee issue. Actually, if I think further, it's more like building a sanctuary city, sort of, right? Yeah, because in the concept of sanctuary community or sanctuary city, it's more about social cohesion than ever. Social cohesion and exhaustive financial and social services.
Yeah, I think I also buy the idea, the issue of this one has to be doing the schedule level together, and also the issues of post-government. Post-government need to be brought on board, as well as the host community. Yeah, the host community, we need to bring including the refugees themselves, discuss issues that pertain to refugees and to ensure protection. Because it's for example, you find there's rivalry between the host and the refugees.
Enforce the laws that prohibit most refugees exploit refugees are important. Also in the local level.
Yeah. So these countries, they are like pro-nations compared to the other. So they should get more resources to get people.
All right. Are people ready? Should we have very, I mean, 15 minutes supposedly, but I'm going to push that to 25 to finish up. I'm going to join you and just sit here because I really like this smaller context, actually. I think it's much more cohesive to actual discussion. So it's going to be really informal from here on out, really. It's just an opportunity for us to talk about some of these issues, to confront some of the challenges in the fundamentals of these questions. These are not perfect questions either. And to see where we can get, and to get the conversation going for the next 2 weeks and beyond. So whoever wants to talk, I think it's also, there's nothing to be worried about these presentations. If you can say what you want, people can interrupt if they have a question. It's really going to be an informal process of just exploring these questions for the coming 15 or 20 minutes or so. So perhaps I'll let this side of the room begin.
Hi everyone. So on behalf of this group, I'd like to present our discussions for the questions that were presented. So for the question number 1, we discussed why refugee issues matter more than ever today. So several points that we discussed is that the issue is basically not going away anytime soon, because there are always new causes for conflict, social conflict, violent conflict, also worsened by situations like proxy war within and among countries, climate change that drive people away from their homes, and the regression in the socio-political situation, particularly in Asia, is also like a contributing factor to why this issue is more urgent. But also is not these factors are not only the downsides, but also could be advantages and opportunities for us. So basically, we as civil society can see this as opportunities to push government to do stronger actions to adequately respond to these issues. So basically that's sort of the overarching answer to question number 1. For number 2, what refugees' roles are in creating or progressing positive change. There are many things. For example, we view that refugees are leaders in advocating for refugee rights and services for the community. So this becomes an example that I give, like in Indonesia, where refugee leaders are at the forefront of providing access to services that are unavailable because the government doesn't provide it. They have been creating learning centers to give access to education, information centers, collecting donations and providing care packages. So all these amazing things that refugees are doing as leaders in the community. Also, like high-skilled refugees bring their skills to host countries and contribute to the host country's economy. So for example, the skill of carpet making in Nepal brought by Tibetan refugees, also Rohingya refugees in Malaysia contributing to the labor sector in Malaysia and thus contributing to their economy. But also not just that, we see that refugees are catalysts for policy change, as the situation, for example, of refugees coming into Indonesia 3 years ago became a reason for the government to, for the first time, draft a legal framework that regulates how to address the issue. Other examples also we consider refugees contribute to cultural diversity, knowledge in the host countries. So for example, different languages, different food, which enriches these host countries and also add depth to the discourse. So for example, if we had only discussed refugees before in terms of being persecuted, having them in the country will also contribute to how we view the perspective from their perspectives as well. The last one is refugees are ambassadors. So through personal interaction with refugees, it will help to change people's views about the issue. So, for example, if people who used to be close-minded or xenophobic, when they first meet refugees and actually we come to understand them as individuals, hear the stories, they will have a change of mind or perspective. And also then the refugees in host countries or transit countries would then become ambassadors of those countries when they become resettled or when they go to the international platforms. And this is very real positive impact that they have as refugee leaders. For the third question, what our roles are, we think that the first and most important role is to facilitate support for refugees to engage in advocacy for legal changes. So it is important now to not presume the position of us doing us as civil societies and non-refugees to do the advocacy or work, but also give facilitate refugees and empower them to speak for themselves, to advocate at a national or international forum, open doors and access for them to lead these advocacy efforts. What we can also do as civil society is raise awareness to increase solidarity and tolerance, and also using our unique position as natives in the country, we can advocate to the government and educate them to guarantee public services, to have a better perspective and understanding of refugee and irregular migration issues. We can, even though we don't necessarily succeed to change government perspectives in whole, but we can, at the very least, think of counter arguments or frame issues that would better suit their interests. So, for example, Evan gave a story of how in Thailand, the government is very concerned about protecting their credibility at the international level. So even though the government might not really care about refugee protection, but they care about saving face. And even if this is the way for us to advocate for refugee protection, as long as it results in the government protecting the refugees or not deporting them, then that is a starting point. And so the last question is how we can best act to create real protection. So first, we can advocate the government, pressure the government for legal framework, either to create new ones or improve existing ones for refugee protection and refugee rights. And we can also hold the government accountable to fulfill the international convention obligations that they have ratified, for example, the Convention on Children or Convention against Violence Against Women. We can also act together as civil society to utilize best practices that have been done in other countries and adapt them to suit the situation in our respective countries. We can internally build community resilience and cohesiveness, particularly against social conflicts happening within our communities. And most importantly, we can also raise awareness among host community members at the local and national levels on the issue. So that's all from us. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you so much. We covered some of you got one, but thank you. You covered a lot of ground there, and I do have one question for you. Or unless anybody else wants to start. I don't know if anybody else has any questions about these. Well, my question is this. I think that question number 2 about refugees. This is a really complicated question, and we talk about it all the time in refugee advocacy. How do we engage refugees in this process? How can we be presenting refugee issues when refugees aren't present to present themselves? And why do we have that role? And I think your observations about it are really apt. But I wonder if you had any conversations about what the obstacles are to that. Because it's very easy to talk about, refugees bringing skills into an economy, helping in service provision jobs with organizations that are advocating for refugees, or bringing refugee issues to the bodies that are determining refugee policy. But did you have any conversations about what the obstacles are to that and how possibly to get around them?
Yeah, I think one of the main issue here is cultural.
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
It's basically cultural incompatibility. Basically, it's hard to present refugee communities that from countries with bad human rights records, like perhaps like from countries like in Middle East, you want to advocate refugees from Yemen or even like Iraq, for example, with very conservative social norms, and then you present it to Norway government, which even like government people in Norway, like if the women don't like something, they can slap the man. because they think he's being impolite. But from people in very conservative Muslim Islamic norms, it's like a very disrespectful for the man instead. So this is a very complicated thing. I also watched a video that talk about just like it's okay to talk about immigrants and refugee issue, but we shouldn't single out the issue on this cultural incompatibility, because without talking about that, we can have social conflicts, because like the exaggerated issue in Germany, like when a local woman got raped by Muslim refugees, even though I don't know that it's true or not. I think it's more like blown up. It's just being blown up by the media, but it just raises concerns. I think
So one of the
that's
challenges
real obstacle.
is a cultural, contextual challenge.
Mhm.
But we're all from different cultures, and we're all here, and we're all getting along fine. I mean, seems to me. So I agree with you on some, but my question, I think, around that would be, leads into your example from Germany, and how the political discourse has seized on otherizing people as a way to further those divisions. And I think you're right about the media too. I mean, crime happens all the time, and yes, refugees are criminals. So are non-refugees. Humans have, a refugee is no different than any other part of society. There are liars that are refugees. There are criminals that are refugees. There are successful business people that are refugees. There are brilliant academics that are refugees. There are loving husbands and wives and mothers and daughters and children that are refugees. There are certainly those elements. But I do think, fundamentally, as someone who has the privilege of moving around the planet, that those cultural differences don't necessarily cause friction in themselves, at least that I've seen. I think that a lot of that, from my perspective, and everyone's free to join in, a lot of that comes from the instrumentalization of that narrative in a larger power structure, at least in my experience. And, what I was more curious, I think, about with the refugee participation question, and that's a big, integration is a big one, I agree. And it turns off a lot of people. It's also just the practical aspects of it. How do refugees who have a qualification in a country to which they no longer belong get a qualification to practice if they're a doctor in another country? How do refugees be considered experts in the refugee field when they've been denied an education by the fact that they've grown up in a refugee camp? And people point to them and say, well, you're not an expert. We have someone here from Australia. They know what the situation is for refugees. But who could know better than a refugee? And some of those practical aspects of this, I think, are really challenging when we come to question number 2. Because, oh, go ahead, please. Please, please.
Sorry, if I can also add to that, another issue that refugee leaders face, at least in Indonesia, is that first, they're not allowed to travel, so that becomes a huge obstacle, because there are like brilliant refugee leaders that are doing great things, but they cannot come to this academy, for example. They cannot speak at the international forum in person. They can do they can do so through Skype, for example, but it really limits what they can do and the impact of what they're doing. Yeah, also like it's very difficult for them to juggle between their advocacy work and their personal lives, because they're facing very difficult situations personally. And so when they are active in doing advocacy work without actually being able to progress naturally in life, without having like clear ideas of what their future will be like, it creates a real struggle. So it as individuals, it really places a huge strain and burden on them, and especially when they're in emergency situations, like they don't have enough money in Indonesia and things like that. It really impacts their lives and their work.
I think there is also one aspect that we need to consider into that is the politics between the host country and the country of origin of the refugees. I want to give an example of my case when we were in Central Africa. The relation between the Sudan government and the Central African government was good, and the government did not want people to go on as refugees there. So they had to negotiate among themselves and put some conditions for refugees that were staying in South Africa, making it difficult. Whereas, for example, if you see Uganda, which has a very good relation with the government of South Sudan now, refugees are relatively well handled in Uganda compared to Central Africa, where we were restricted from movement, and also because there was the National Commission for Refugees, which was a government institution supported by UNHCR. For example, getting repatriation out of 37,000 people, the number of people who went on repatriation cannot reach 20. And we had issues of restriction of movement, and I was telling in our group here, when we reached refugees, leaders wanted us to have a curriculum of Sudan curriculum, where we taught in English and Arabic. But the government there, refused, because that was not matching, their curriculum. So those kind of things, the politics of the two countries can also greatly impact on a refugee role that they can play in the host country. Yeah.
Absolutely. Actually, I want to ask you something. Do you think that refugees tend to be, in some way or another, in some level or another, to be more progressive than their origin community?
Not necessarily, and I think this points to the point our colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina raised this morning, is that sometimes refugees can be more exclusionary of people. Sometimes they can be more protective and isolationist of their own tight communities. Sometimes refugees can be very conservative in many ways. And I think where we really see that change is generationally as well. People who have been refugees or come from refugee families can be some of the most exclusive communities in countries in which they've settled. And I think, where that comes from, I think there are a lot of factors. I don't think that refugees are necessarily more progressive than anyone else, but refugees do know what they need in order to survive, and they know their experience.
Sure.
And in that way, I think they can create and present a really progressive vantage point for us to move these issues forward. And that's examining all of it. It's examining the histories of being refugees for generations back, or it's examining the really current situation of refugees now in Uganda from South Sudan, or whatever the case may be. I don't think they're necessarily more progressive or less progressive. They just happen to have had the experience of being driven out of where they come from. And I think that they bring with them, sometimes they're driven out for being conservative people, because the government is very progressive in certain ways, but wants to maintain its grip on power and otherizes that particular ideology. Or the opposite, where the progressive people are being driven out. I mean, you can look at refugees coming out of any number of states in the Gulf region, for example, that are coming out because they're progressing the idea of LGBT rights, or they're progressing the idea of being able to get an education for women. So I think it's a broad swath, personally. And that's my.
I should have recorded that.
We only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure that this group has a chance to present, and then we will break for lunch. I don't know if anybody wants a microphone to speak or not. I don't think we need them at this point.
Oh, I am? I only volunteered to write.
No, you're forced to.
Never accept the writing role. You know what the answer is going to be.
So if it's okay, I wouldn't use the microphone anymore. So our general answer to the first question, why do refugee issues matter, is that there is a universality of humanity. So it's basically because we're all human that refugee issues matter, because they are human and we are human. It is our obligation to extend help. So that's the general answer, and we have some specific answers. Number one is that basic human rights of refugees are endangered, and as co-humans, it is our role to do something about it and ensure that they enjoy the same freedoms that we enjoy. Number two, they are exposed to a different kind of danger that we are fortunate enough not to endure. And that is why we have to do something about it to make sure that everyone else is protected. And third, refugees are us. They are the we, they are the us, they're everyone. So when we talk about the vulnerable sector, like the indigenous peoples, women, children, the persons with disabilities, they are disadvantaged on one access, that is by being disabled, or by being a woman, or by being a child. And they are disadvantaged on another access, another access, which is being a refugee. So a refugee is someone who suffers from disadvantages not just on one part. It's basically twofold. Like a woman who becomes a refugee is disadvantaged on two angles. A child is disadvantaged on two angles. So these are the issues that we have to dwell on as human beings, because they are everyone. They could be anyone. They could be related to us, and that they lack legal protection. So we discussed that the legal protection afforded by international law is not enough, and that is why we have to forward discussions so that changes to these national and international frameworks could be done. And then by doing something about these issues, we can set a standard that can be followed by different countries in the world. And okay, let's move to the next part because these are specific answers. What role do refugees play in progressing positive change? It's similar to the group's answer, but refugees are catalysts. They're catalysts of different things. Number one, they are catalysts of discussion, which could lead to material solutions in addressing their issues. Number two, refugees, in a way, just like what you said, are good for local politics, promoting a culture of tolerance, progression of democracy, a sharing of learning experiences and knowledge. And refugees can also inspire social revolution from different corners of the world and inspiring humanitarian effort. While some states deny refugees entry, some states are encouraged to extend support to them. One example with regard to how refugees can help the local community was given by Jackson, that there were medical doctors who were doctors in their origin countries, and then when they were sent to their host countries as refugees, they were still able to help in the camps as doctors, as teachers. So they were doctors there, they were teachers there, they were nurses there, and then they were sent to another country, still doing the same for the local community. And indirectly, the refugee situation helps promote change in the economy, in education, in the social-cultural aspect, and infrastructure. And related to that, what is our role here? Our main role is to call for action for all of these things. Number one, we should call out the injustices. Whereas before, when we say call out injustice, we engage or we join mass movements, we walk the streets. Now there's a different dimension to social protests. We can do it in social media, if you remember the Occupy movement. And then we can do it by engaging our neighbors in discussions, informing them about who refugees are, what issues they're facing, what can we do in our personal ways. We can be an asset to protect human lives, promote changes by joining causes, promoting advocacies that target them. And lastly, we ourselves can share our own experiences that could change public opinion and come up with solutions that are durable, which is related to our answer to number 4. How can we best act to create real protection? So our opinion is that to be able to know what real protection is, we first have to ask the refugees, what is real protection to them? Because what is real protection to us may not necessarily be real protection to them. We might think we're offering protection, which is good for them. In whose perspective? It's in our perspective. So it's best to ask them so that we can have an inclusive discussion, bring them to the table, invite civil society organizations, invite regional institutions like the European Union, ASEAN, African Union.
Yes.
Yeah, African Union and other regional institutions, local and national, so that we would be able to have a strategic planning, because most of the problems we see is that there is a disjunction between the international framework and the national framework. So even if the international framework says, let's do this, let's do that, if it doesn't coincide with what is done nationally, domestically, then there's the problem. So the issue of refugees and our humanitarian effort must not end when they voluntarily go back to their countries. It must also extend to how they are going to be integrated or reintegrated into society. Their mental health is important, especially for children. They're having an opportunity to lead a dignified life by having job opportunities, proper education. Actually, we discussed a lot of things. Let's just look at the time.
I don't know if anyone, yeah, I'm getting a signal that we're over time. I don't know if anyone has any immediate reactions to that. I will say one thing. I think that last point is critical. That we can't continue to envision support for refugees just by these thresholds of you're declared to have received refugee status, or you've fled your country and you have now received some other status. That these questions go much beyond those two thresholds, both into looking at what's driving refugees, what's driving processes that are creating refugees, how do we affect those issues fundamentally? How do refugees end up playing into those issues? These are cyclical movements quite often. And also what happens afterwards? When someone is denied refugee status and is deported, do we follow up? Do we know what happens? No one has any data on this. When refugees go back on their own silently at night one time because they can no longer survive in the confines of a refugee camp, what happens to those people? They're still refugees that went back. Where can we continue to make sure that we're looking at this in a larger perspective? And I think that that's a really good, strong point. The other is that this last question, how can we best act to create real protection? Ignore all of it except how. And I think over the coming weeks and days, and with your colleagues and with your friends, and when you're thinking about, well, maybe trying to clear your head before going to sleep, but I know that oftentimes before I go to sleep, I think about things like, how do we actually make this happen? That's the real key question here. And I think the purpose of this lecture this morning was to ask why refugee issues matter. And we've identified a lot of reasons. But I think moving forward, now we have to figure out how. How do we continue? How do we address circumstances that are becoming more and more restrictive? What avenues are available to us? Where do we see success? And where do we see new opportunities? So I would leave it at that because I know we're already over time and there's a lunch break now, but thank you all for engaging so thoroughly with this discussion and with these themes. It's been a pleasure to be a part of the discussion today. I really enjoyed especially the second half and listening to people's ideas. So thank you.